Gladly. Yes. Well, thank you so much, everyone. We're so pleased to have you all join us today. And the PAC is thrilled to be hosting this webinar series. We're building on the series that we started as in person in Ann Arbor earlier this year, and building on this series with two additional webinars. Today, we have Finding Your Narrative. And next week, we have Engaging Broader Audiences. And our speaker today is Dr. Brian Zikmund-Fisher. And next week, we'll have Patty Spears presenting and hosting and facilitating an engaging workshop as well. Ellen and I are pleased to represent the PAC as co-chairs. And the SMDM PAC, the Patient Advisory Council, is a representative group of patients and caregivers who meet regularly with leaders of the society to help ensure that patients and caregivers' needs and perspectives are represented in the ongoing operations of the society. We currently have 4 members. We have members here in the US, and then also we have a member in the UK as well. Janet, Amy, Katie, and Naomi have been participating in our monthly meetings, as well as participating in our webinars and helping to lead the PAC efforts throughout the year. So I will jump right into our webinar today. So Finding Your Narrative. Dr. Brian Zikmund-Fisher will be leading this today, and he is the professor of health behavior and health equity research in internal medicine and the interim co-director for bioethics and social sciences in medicine in the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan. His work focuses on designing and evaluating methods and making health data, such as risk statistics or laboratory tests, more intuitively meaningful across a variety of end users, including patients, clinicians, and policymakers. He also studies the impact of people's consistent preferences for more versus less healthcare on over and underutilization of care and explores the power of narratives in health communications. Many of his projects involve collaborations with clinicians on a wide range of specialties, including internal medicine, family medicine, oncology, ophthalmology, gastroenterology, surgery, and pharmacy. He is the editor-in-chief of Medical Decision Making and MDM Policy and Practice, and I'm happy to invite him as our speaker today. Hand it over to him.
Great, thank you. I was just listening to you rattle off my bio and going, "Oh yeah, I'm no longer interim director of that center. Yay!"
Oh, check.
So minor update. I managed to transition out of that interim role, but I'm still all the other stuff. I'm going to talk today about essentially an application of the idea of storytelling and narrative toward science communication. And we'll do some practicing of that task. And really, this comes out of a merging of multiple parts of my background and my interest. I got obviously very interested in health communication more broadly. How do we communicate information in ways that can make people understand it? And one of the things that came out of my research was a realization that part of the problem, especially in the number communication space, is that we throw numbers at people without deciding what it is, why it is we're doing that. And so the sort of like question of what is our goal? What is somebody supposed to get out of a communication became very salient to me. And that theme comes back in the larger question of how do we design an abstract, a presentation, a poster, et cetera. So let me share my screen, and I will go through a relatively short list of a set of slides, just sort of touching upon these larger themes. And then we're going to spend most of the time sort of thinking about what can we do as communicators to transform our scientific content into, basically a story form so that it will be more understandable to people. So I've already sort of said this, but I really want to ground this in a fundamental belief I have, and this is not just me. I think this is really well supported in the larger communication literature, which is that people's ability to hold on to information is way more limited than most communicators recognize. So if you think about a clinical consultation, the patient's going to remember one thing you say. They're not going to remember 47 things. So what is that one thing? And in the context of a research presentation, an abstract, et cetera, people are really only going to retain one thing from our article or our presentation. The critical point, though, is that we get to choose what that one thing is. So the main thing I want to sort of emphasize here is this idea of message prioritization. How do we shape that one message that we hope our audience will take away from our presentation? So let's take a moment and look at how is a prototypical research presentation structured? And we've all listened to these and we've all watched them and read them in terms of abstract form, et cetera. And it kind of usually looks something like this. Like it's sort of this hourglass shape where we start with some big picture and context and significance. We might then make that a little bit more concrete and some background details, and we lead to some sort of hypothesis or question. That motivates the research that we get into. We define our methods and we collect some data based upon those methods. We interpret that data and then we lead, hopefully at the end, into a larger discussion of the impact or implications of our research. That's at least what it should look like. But let's be honest, this is what it usually looks like. We blow through the background on significance and hypothesis and methods. It's super fast because we feel like we've got to get to our data. And then we spend the vast majority of our time presenting data and more data and more data and more data and more data. And maybe if we're not running late, we actually get to talk briefly about interpretation and implications. But there are certainly plenty of times in which we're running short on time. And it's sort of like a 15-second conclusion because that's all the time that we have available to us. And of course, that's a problem because absorbing all of that information at once is essentially impossible. Nobody is going to absorb all of those data points presented, particularly sort of crammed together in that way. We need a scaffolding. We need something to anchor on so that we can pull out the pieces of that information that we really want to hold on to as an audience member. And that ultimately is the idea of creating structure or scaffolding for scientific communications. Now, I really love the following quote. This comes from the book Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath, which at least in the US was a bestseller back about almost 20 years ago now, talking about what makes information memorable to people. And the core idea here, which exists throughout the world, is the idea that when we have patterns, we sort of assume something is coming next, and our brains are well suited for creating patterns and finding patterns. But where you get somebody's attention is when they think they have the pattern and then you break it. So we need to find the pattern of the science that we're going to present and then present something that's going to be grabbing of somebody's attention. And the best sort of simple way of doing this that I found comes from Randy Olson. Now, Randy Olson has a fascinating background. Randy Olson was a tenured professor of marine biology who at age 39 quit voluntarily from his university, went to Hollywood, went to film school and became a documentary film producer. And he's written a series of books, these are two of them, about the applications of narrative to science communication. And the reason he emphasizes narrative so much is if we really think about the classic narrative structure, the three-act structure, I mean, this has existed in literature for thousands of years, literally. What we see is a pattern of tension. At the start of the story, there's no tension, but something happens that raises the tension, that grabs the person's attention, that breaks the schemas of what existed before. And then as the story progresses, we resolve that tension. And that's what often leads us to feel a sense of accomplishment at the end of a story, is that we've resolved that tension to at least some degree. So how do we apply that? Well, what Randy Olson suggests is that we apply that by using what he calls the and, but, therefore story structure, or ABT. And so the idea is that the basic structure of a story is you have a start, a setup, that's the background. But then there is a tension. And notice I'm doing this right now. We have a structure, but then there is a tension. And that then leads us to some form of resolution that is the conclusion, the therefore of the story that we're talking about. So how do we apply this in a science context? Well, basically what science ABTs look like is this. You start and your background is really telling the audience what we already know. what exists in the literature, what facts are already known, etc. And then almost always in science, there is some knowledge gap. There is something that is unknown or something that is novel, that is breaking the model of what we previously believed. And that pivot point becomes the anchor of the story of the science that's being done. And it leads naturally to the implications. If we don't know something, then we need to do studies to find that out. If our theory is wrong, then we need to change our theory to fix it. If we have data that is fundamentally different than we expected it to be, then we need to understand what the implications of that is, etc. So the critical idea here is that when we're telling science stories, we need to be thinking about finding the but. What is the tension at the heart of the science that we're telling in a given abstract or in a given presentation? What's not yet known? And perhaps coming out of our work, what's the novel element or the crucial insight that is the anchor point of the story that we need to tell? So finding the but helps us to tell the story of our science. Now, I'll give you a really simple example of this. Sun exposure is dangerous, and sunscreen can protect you, right? This is background. This is stuff we already know. But it wears off after time, right? So that's the tension there. Sunscreen will protect me, but it will not protect me forever because it'll wear off, especially if I'm swimming or if I wipe my skin. And the fact that it will wear off leads to the implication of the instruction. You need to reapply sunscreen regularly in order to get the protection that you want. And in fact, if you look at many types of public-facing science communication, you'll see this pattern appearing over and over again. Now, I'm a particular fan of theconversation.com as a site for communicating science to broad audiences. It exists globally, different parts. I've written for it in the US a couple times. I just pulled here a single example from a couple years ago of a conversation piece. And these are the first 4 paragraphs of this conversation piece. But if you look at it, it's an and but therefore story, right? We're starting off background. Toxicology is famous for proclaiming that the dose makes the poison. But increasing evidence suggests that even low levels of endocrine disrupting chemicals can interfere with hormonal signals. And another but statement, standard toxicity tests don't always detect these effects. Okay, so that's 2 problems right there, and they're related. Therefore, we need to do work to change this. So therefore, EPA commissioned and asked the committee of scientists to study the issue in detail, blah, blah, blah. And then off we go, running into the question of what do we do about these 2 problems that we've defined in these starting paragraphs? So really, there's 2 structures I want to sell today. One is the research question ABT. Research question ABT is we start with the and. This is what we know already, but there's something we don't yet know. Whatever it is, the specific thing that is not known at the moment. That's the problem that defines the need for a particular study, i.e. the therefore. We don't know this, therefore we're going to conduct a particular type of study to answer this particular research question. And then there's the research finding ABT. Now, this is a little bit trickier, but it's a really important idea here, which is that when you're presenting research findings, you don't necessarily structure them in the order you got them, or even in the order you'd put them in the paper. You structure them to create the story of them. Usually when we do research, some of what we found, we kind of knew we were going to find. It's more expected. It doesn't change our understanding of the world, right? There's no implications of it. It's just confirmation of something we already knew. That's the background. That's the and stuff. But the most powerful part of any given research is the part that is surprising or critically important, the stuff that ultimately will change practice, will change what we need to do next in research, et cetera. We have to find that critical component because that leads naturally to the study implications. And so when we get to our conclusion, we'd better be saying, because of the but thing that we just found, because of this critical piece of information that came from this research, therefore we now need to whatever it is we need to do. Conduct further research in practical context. We need to change our theory. We need to whatever. So Now let me map this back just to wrap up my little bit of slides here. This actually maps very smoothly to that hourglass shape design that we, at least in theory, ought to be doing when we're doing a scientific presentation. Because in a scientific presentation, we have to do two core stories. We have to tell the research question story. What didn't we know that set up the specific design of our study? And then when we get into our data and our results, we need to separate the not transformative data from the surprising, the critical, the transformative finding that we have, and then have that piece lead in ultimately into the impact and implications, i.e. the therefore of our story. So this is a approach to designing abstracts and communications that I think has a lot of power, but the challenge here is you have to be able to find the but. You have to be able to find the thing it is that you really want to highlight, that this is the most important piece of my study. And so to practice that, I also want to demonstrate for you, and then we're going to practice as a group, an exercise that is called Half-Life Your Message. And I actually have a scientific paper on this that we published back in 2018. This is an exercise derived from improv theater in which we talk through an idea that we want to communicate about our science for 60 seconds. And you do this out loud so that you can, this isn't the same thing as writing, so that you're allowing yourself the fluidity that you have in a regular conversation. And so you set a timer and you give yourself 60 seconds to do this. And then when the timer is done, as soon as you're done, you reset the timer, but only for half as much time, for 30 seconds. And then you talk about exactly the same thing, but now you only have half the time. So you got to let stuff go. And you do it again. And when you're done with your 30 seconds, you reset the timer for 15 seconds and you talk about the same thing. But now you got to let go of even more. And when you're done, it's not that you necessarily think that you find the perfect soundbite at 15 seconds. But when you're done, you ask yourself, what did I learn by going through this exercise? Usually what people just say, come back and say is, I learned I started the wrong place. I skipped over the most important point. I didn't get to the where I really wanted to get to until I reorganized. Or they sort of say, wait a second, I'm telling the wrong story. Like I'm ending up someplace I didn't want to end up. It's not that we're trying to market, like we're trying to find a 3-word soundbite for a story, but we are trying to understand that message prioritization. What is the one message that we want to say about our research? And this is an exercise that can help us do that. So um, before you do it, we usually like to do is to have people think about sort of like, okay, what's the audience? Who are you talking to? What's our goals in thinking about this? And then step 3 is to practice this so that we can get the message out of the science that we want to be talking about. However, just to show you how this is done, I'm going to demo this. And to make it obvious that I'm not actually making this up. I mean, I am making this up. Like I haven't practiced this. I haven't written a script or anything. We actually have a choice for all of you attendees as to what topic I'm going to demonstrate this with. So you should now see on your screen a poll. You have there 3 topics that I can talk about from, these are collaborations that I've been doing over the last few years. Go ahead and vote. What do you want me to talk about? And whenever the polls, most people have answered, Matthias, if you can tell us the results.
As of right now, it's a tie.
Uh-oh. Do I get to tie break?
It looks like it. Oh, I
All
think
right.
we have a
Well,
winner. Can patients understand prostate biopsy pathology reports?
all right. Sounds great. All right. So now I am going to do this. And what I am going to do is that I have done this many times. I actually have a slide that's a counter. So I'm going to let the slide show you my countdown because it also allows me to do this. But let me just set up the background here. So this is a collaboration between myself and a pathologist about how challenging it is for people to understand pathology reports. And my real first audience here is clinicians. It's the pathologists who need to understand just how difficult it is for patients to understand these reports. So I'm going to think with that audience in mind as I'm designing this. And my main goal is to have them really take away, yeah, there's an issue here. Like this is something that's important that they need to pay attention to. All right. So I will get myself ready and then go. So we live in a world now where every test result, every test the patient has, a report gets generated and sent to them directly in their patient portal. And patients have direct access to these healthcare reports. And they look at them and they want to know what they mean. And so it's really important that when we make reports that patients can understand that. In the context of prostate cancer, the biopsy report's a really critical thing here. So patients are looking at that report, wanting to know, do I have cancer? If I do have cancer, am I at high risk? What should I be feeling about this biopsy? But we conducted a study that looked to see whether or not the current formats were something the patients could understand. And what we found was that not only did the current formats, they couldn't even tell whether or not they had cancer or not most of the time, but that there was a simple change to a more patient-centered format could drastically increase patients' understanding of this. And so that means we really need to change the forms that patients are seeing. All right, so that's my 60-second version. Now I got to do this in 30 seconds. And so I'm not going to try and speak out loud now. I'm just going to move right into doing this again and let this experience shape what it is that I talk about. Patients get lots of reports directly from doctors in the patient portal. And think about, for example, like a prostate biopsy report. Patients want to know, do I have cancer? Am I at high risk or not? So we tested whether patients would understand, be able to answer those questions given the current format, or whether they could understand it better in a patient-centered format. And we found a dramatic shift in the sense that patients were far better able to tell whether or not they had cancer and what their risk level was if they got the patient-centered report. All right, so now I got to boil this down to 15 seconds. Okay, so just going to move directly into it. Patients don't understand the prostate biopsy reports that they get. We showed that a patient-centered format allowed patients to understand far better whether or not they had cancer and what their risk level was, and we need to change the reports they see. Okay, I didn't quite get it all in into 15 seconds, but what did I learn? Spent way too much time on that initial background of the access to the reports in the patient portal. I didn't even get to giving you concrete numbers, but that's okay. I was able to get to the main point of the patient-centered report is better on did you have cancer and what your risk level was, which I think is the core that I really want everybody to understand from this. And now that I know that, I can think about writing an abstract that makes sure to define that question. Is how does the current report compare to a patient-centered report? And to my conclusion, I'm going to make very clear that the patient-centered report was a drastic improvement over the existing reports on those measures. And so that clarity of purpose is now orienting me in terms of what needs to be in my introduction, what needs to be in my conclusion, and to set up what aspects of the design I'm going to spend more versus less time on in trying to write the methods and discussion and results part of an abstract. Okay, so now that we've demoed this, the plan is you do it. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Matthias is going to break people up into pairs of attendees plus a PAC member to help facilitate this. So there's going to be, we'll work out the rounding here, but basically 3 people in each breakout room. And what we're going to have each pair do is to do the half-life your message exercise on a study that you're thinking about. Either you've published it recently or you're working on it now or something like that. Pick a particular study that you might want to be presenting about. And we'll go through this exercise. And I will stay in the main room and basically use the broadcast mechanism of the Zoom to give you timing. So I will put in the thing, okay, so pick who's going to go first, ready, set, go. I will give you a 30-second mark. I will give you a 15-second mark. I will give you a 5-second mark, and then you wrap it up. And I'll give you some time to do that debriefing the way I did, talking to your people in the room about, hey, what did you learn in this exercise? And then that'll take about 7 or 8 minutes. Well, I'll say, hey, it's time to switch. You'll switch roles. You'll go through the same exercise. And when we're both people have done it, then we'll call everybody back into the main room. And so the rest of the today, just sort of talking about this experience. How was this helpful? Do you see this ABT format being useful to you in terms of the way you're presenting, et cetera? All right. So just reminder here with this slide, before you start doing it, do spend a couple seconds talking out loud, like who's the audience you'd really want to talk to? What is your larger communication goal? And then at the end, make sure to do a debriefing. Like, what did you learn? Did you want to do it differently, et cetera? And not that you have to do it, but just reflect upon what you learned in the process.